Hey everybody, welcome back to Mass Office Hours at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday night, which means it's time to go live and answer some fitness questions in the chat. Before we get into all the fitness content, a few major announcements. First of all, Mike Zordos, our esteemed colleague, has asked me to send hate to Notre Dame and to all its fans, courtesy of their loss to Northern Illinois. Duke, UNC, and Ohio State are all rolling in college football. Helms, I don't know if I mentioned this. This is a college football show now. We've covered that a couple weeks ago. Also an NFL football show because I'm first place in my fantasy football league, and I have demanded that we shut everything down, stop the count, just to be safe. Usually week 2 and beyond, that's where scores start to get unreliable. There's a lot of cheating. So hopefully we'll get that stopped and do the right thing. But the major announcement, Helms, is that tonight, is the 53rd episode of Mass Office Hours. And guess what? It's a weekly show, which makes this the 1-year official commemoration anniversary. I haven't even checked to see the exact date of our first episode, but I'm going to assume that we were just reliable every single Wednesday night. So we're calling it 1 year. Yeah, 53 episodes, one a week. So we made it. I think theoretically, this is where people arbitrarily start calling it season 2 of a weekly podcast. I'm probably not going to do that because I actually do put the metadata on all the episode files. So we're rolling with season 1 probably until the end of the calendar year. But Helms, how are you feeling about the 1 year anniversary?
Oh man, I mean, if this were a marriage, we're like 1/4 of the way before we get to the point where probabilistically we're likely still going to stay together. So I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic. I feel good about it. I feel accomplished. I think my feelings are much less relevant because I'm here a solid 1/4 of the time, or 1/3 of the time, excuse me, because you always have a guest host. But you, my friend, you're always here, holding down the fort, even when one of us is not. You do a solo episode. You do what needs to be done. You are the office hours champ, as our colleague Dr. Mike Zordos would say. And all jokes aside, I think you should be proud. And I know that I'm proud of you and appreciative for all the work that you put into office hours. And I hope all the folks who tune in, especially those who tune in live, have appreciated all the time and effort we put forth to try to answer your questions here, your burning questions that seem to never stop. And that's okay because we'll never stop. Most likely, probabilistically, based upon the stats I said earlier. Disclaimer, we might stop, but we don't intend to stop.
Yeah, it's not just okay. It's kind of critical that the questions don't stop.
True.
Because I don't know what we'll do. No, I think we started doing this show for a variety of reasons, but one of the big ones is that, back in the day, I mean, this is the reason that I was interested in it. Back in the day, fitness, evidence-based fitness happened on Facebook. I guess if you want to go all the way back, it happened on the bodybuilding.com forums and a few others. So it started in the forums. It migrated more to like Facebook groups. But both of those allow for kind of back and forth, open conversation, debate, so to speak, that, we're not just slinging mud and then running away. Those types of discussions in evidence-based fitness used to happen on platforms where it would look really weird if you just like made a hot take and then never engaged with the people who said, well, what about this? What about that? But as things kind of shifted into being more, I mean, it was never really that big like fitness Twitter, but, especially getting into Instagram and TikTok, now a lot of times you'll see a post and you'll say, oh, that's a very hot take that might be kind of stupid and doesn't agree with like 4 of these studies just off the top of my head. And you throw those PubMed IDs in the comments and you're just shouting into the void, right? You never get your questions answered. And to some extent, it's not a good medium for that. The volume of comments gets cumbersome really quickly if you have a huge following. And yeah, I mean, it's just not good for a back and forth, and it's not good for addressing questions that get put in the comments. So in response to that, I think, doing a live Q&A is kind of the best you could do when it comes to social media platforms that aren't functionally dead for people under the age of like 30, right? So
I would
yeah,
agree mostly. I would say if you want to get a feel for what was fitness like in 2010 and even 2005 in that kind of intermediate period before Facebook really became the dominant platform, think of a Reddit AMA. That wasn't a specific thing like, oh, this guy or gal or person is going to be on Reddit. They're going to do an Ask Me Anything. Cool. I get this window of time and opportunity. And then once those 2 hours are gone, well, if I miss my question, it's gone. That was just everything and the way it was. So this is the audio visual version of that, folks. And is it what YouTube likes? No. Look at our glacial slow growth on our YouTube channel. But it certainly is a better option than, resurrecting our, say, MySpace account or jumping back on the bodybuilding.com forums.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, for the young folks back in the day, you'd have like, a lot of times it'd be like a few just like Hall of Fame threads that have a million pages to them. And then there were always a few threads where you're like, if I really want to get so-and-so's opinion, I know they're going to be hanging out in here, right? And so you had just kind of this perpetual access.
What does Straight Flex have to say about an intro workout waxy maize starch? I must know.
Yeah, man, we need to get back to some of that stuff. Just talking about the molecular structure of different new carbohydrate polymers. That was... What a beautiful thing for bodybuilding that was. All right, folks. This is just going to be a couple of decrepit old men reminiscing about fitness. But no, we got to get into it. We got to answer some fitness questions. But before we do that, we mentioned our glacial pace of growth on YouTube. Folks, that's kind of on you. Not really our fault, which is a theme around here. I take no responsibility, but if you want to support the show... there are many ways you could do that. You could like, rate, subscribe, review wherever you get the show. Tell a friend. Send them a link to our YouTube, to our Spotify, to our Apple Podcasts. Join us live to be part of the fun. But if you can't join us live, of course, you can always drop a question at massresearchreview.com/office hours with a hyphen between the words office and hours. All right, Helms, I think it's probably time to dive right into the chat here. The first one, this is tough. So I am going to address it, or at least put it on the table here and see if you have any feelings about it. It's a topic that I genuinely don't know anything about.
Okay.
What do you know about nasal breathing? Do you know anything about it?
So, when one breathes through their nose rather than their mouth, Trex, I don't know if you're aware of this, the nasal passage, that's considered nasal breathing. When you're breathing through your mouth, that's not.
Yeah.
That is the end of my knowledge.
Yeah, me too, basically. I do have some anecdotal experience. You might even hear that I'm a little bit more nasally today. For a while there, I just couldn't breathe through my nose. Like, it was awful. I finally found a good stack of like allergy protocols, so to speak. Like I like a good, Zyrtec, Claritin, the Flonase. I got my stack put together,
good.
and yeah, and it was really working well. But I'm getting surgery tomorrow, which means I had to like stop some of my allergy meds just to make sure I don't do anything wacky with the anesthesia. So basically I'm going to not be able to breathe through my nose probably tomorrow, which sucks. But yeah, I went a long time being like completely unable, or just like 5 out of 7 days of the week not being able to breathe through my nose. And so I can tell you the absolute extreme case of not doing any nasal breathing ever, and it was fine. It's not like once I figured this stuff all out and got a good allergy protocol in place, it's not like I was like, oh my God, I sleep better and I'm training better and I'm recovering and growing like a weed. I mean, I didn't notice anything of that nature. I would say, I do know that there's some research out there with some specific outcomes. Generally speaking, if you have a functioning nose and there's something correctable that's causing you to be unable to use it, you'll probably be happier and more comfortable if you address it. But in terms of people going to the extremes with it and doing like, I know there's a lot of like people taping their mouth and stuff like that. I just don't know anything about it. But yeah, if I'd say if you are unable to breathe through your nose, you probably would like to reestablish that ability, and I would definitely encourage it because it just is better. It's a better way to live. But that's all I got.
One other thing to add. I remember when I was participating in a study during my PhD that required us to sit there with a catheter in our arm measuring continuous blood glucose and insulin response. I was sitting there next to someone else who's participated in this study who happened to be a researcher in another one of the schools in our faculty, clinical sciences. And because we were sitting there for 5 hours, we were talking. And he shared me the fact that he was doing research on nasal breathing rhythms during sleep. And apparently you do switch between being dominant on your left and right nasal passage, assuming they're open over time. And there is some circadian and physiological reason and rationale for that.
Yeah.
So what you've gotten from asking this question is Trex telling you that he did live through not being able to breathe through his nose, that it is probably a good idea if you can to breathe through your nose, and that research does exist on nasal breathing, but nothing else besides that. So aren't you glad you asked us?
Yeah. But the person who asked did say they've tried nasal strips and they seem to work, but they might be placeboing themselves. If by they work, you mean you could breathe better, that makes sense. I don't think that's a placebo. If you find it less effortful to breathe through your nose, that makes all the sense in the world. In terms of like a very direct, acute, one-to-one kind of impact on your performance, that might be placebo-ish. If there's an impact on performance, I'd be pretty stunned if it was substantial.
Yep.
Okay, so next, how does the change in substrates, carbon fat utilization, how does that change when exercising? At what stage of working out is the energy source predominantly fat versus carbohydrate? I'm kind of like butchering the question here, but that's the general gist of it. And Helms, I'll take a stab at this one since I threw you under the bus with the nose question. For us, it's like there's always a kind of a, I don't know if it's the same way in New Zealand, but my understanding, my observation in American academia, in the world of exercise science, is that there's two lectures no one wants to do. Every time I've ever been asked by someone higher up the food chain than me, like, hey, do you mind doing a guest lecture? I'm going to be out of town. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. There's two that nobody wants to do. The respiratory system and the renal system, breathing and kidneys. No one in exercise science really likes to do those, at least no one that I've been around. So that's why if you ask a question about nasal breathing, you're going to get crickets in the vast majority of places. But anyway, I forget where I was going with that. But we're going to talk a little bit about oxidation here, fuel, substrate utilization. So when we talk about the change in utilization, there are kind of two different time scales that we could talk about for change, right? So in the very acute time scale, we're talking about literally in a matter of, I'm sitting on my couch, I get up and stand, I start walking out my front door, I work my way into a jog, a run, and a sprint. In that immediate kind of super narrow time course, you're going to see that at rest, if I'm fasted, I'm going to be burning almost all fat as the fuel source. Now, does that make me a fat burning machine? Not really, because I'm not burning that much energy at all, right? Just my normal resting metabolic rate. Now, if I just had a huge carbohydrate meal, things would be different because I would be, kind of clearing out some of the carbohydrate that just came in. I'd have a more mixed ratio of carbohydrate and fat utilization. Now, and the exact ratio there is going to depend on how much carbohydrate, how rapidly did it enter my bloodstream, things like that. So let's say I'm fasted. At rest, totally burning fat. As I work my way up higher and higher and higher intensities, I'm going to be burning more and more and more carbohydrate as a proportion, percentage, a relative kind of inversion where we go from all fat, minimal carb, all the way up to essentially all carb, minimal fat at a full, super high intensity sprint. The important thing to keep in mind there is this matters for fueling certain types of performance, but it really, in my opinion, shouldn't become part of the equation if you're just trying to use exercise as a means of facilitating fat loss. Sometimes people get caught in a bit of a trap, I would say, where they get really fixated on staying in a fat burning zone. And really what they're doing there is capping their intensity and just taking options off the table. And not just options, but also the options that burn the most calories per unit time. So pretty good options, especially if you're pretty busy. Now that's not a problem. You can get lean using low intensity cardio, moderate, high intensity, whatever you like. But there's really no solid justification for getting too fixated on trying to specifically burn fat during your exercise. Because what's going to happen is if instead you did higher intensity stuff, you'd burn a higher percentage of carbohydrate during the bout, but you'd burn more total calories. And then as you're recovering from that bout, you are going to have a kind of sustained increase in energy expenditure. You will end up burning that fat on the back end. So in the short time course, that's how it works. It's really not worth thinking about too much unless you're thinking, hey, I am running, I'm doing a sport tomorrow that involves repeated sprinting. I better make sure I eat plenty of carbohydrate because I'm going to be using those when I'm sprinting. That's about as far as we can go with the interpretation. And I will say this, if you are doing really high volumes, even if the intensity is relatively low, you'll still want to have plenty of carbohydrate. Common misnomer, people think, oh, well, if I'm doing a marathon, that's to the layperson, maybe they're thinking that's low intensity because it's not a sprint. It's actually not low intensity if you're doing it if you're doing it for real. But anyway, people will say, well, I'll just utilize fat. That'll be fine. I don't need the carbohydrate. Talk to a marathoner. That ain't going to work out well. You get to mile 18, 19, 20. You do what they call bonking, and you are a very unhappy camper. So, even if you're doing fairly low intensity stuff, just brisk walking, the percentage of carbohydrate isn't through the roof, but it's not zero. And so if you do enough volume, you will get to a point where you've kind of depleted your accessible carbohydrate stores and you don't have a good time. You feel like crap, performance tanks. Now in the long term, zooming out, looking at a different time scale, one element of training, Helms, is that our body changes when we train. That's kind of the whole point, right? Induce very specific adaptations in response to specific training styles. And so our body will shift to some extent its ability to utilize different substrates. And it'll shift in response to not only training, but also nutrition. So you can kind of modulate the way that your body utilizes carbohydrate and fat as a fuel source. So, for example, there's been some really interesting research by Louise Burke and others as well, but she's really championed this cause and done a lot of the really good stuff in this area. But what's interesting is that people on ketogenic diets, she's done work with them where they get kind of adapted to a high-fat, super low-carb diet, and then right before race day or time trial day, they say, here, have plenty of carbohydrate. And what's really fascinating is you think, oh, cool, well, now they have the carbs, they can go use them when they exercise, no harm done. They get the benefits of fat adaptation and the benefits of having carbs around. But it turns out they actually really struggle to utilize those carbohydrates in a time-efficient way. So they're trying to kick into that top gear of exercise intensity and start relying more on carbs. They don't have the enzymatic machinery to actually do that in an efficient way, and it holds them back. So that's an interesting element to consider. But just, assuming you're on a more moderate, a more typical dietary pattern, we will find that over time, as you are getting more aerobically fit, you will increase your ability to oxidize fat. And same thing, if you're doing a lot of sprint work, you will kind of build up some of that enzymatic machinery to do really, really time efficient carbohydrate metabolism. It's not a zero sum game. So if you are just getting super fit and doing a ton of sprint work, then what that's going to mean is overall at lower intensities, you're going to improve your ability to utilize fat and save some of that carbohydrate for later. And then you'll only tap into it when you really need to. So we do have a general shift where that point where you start crossing over from more fat to more carb utilization actually does move a little bit in a very favorable way as you get more and more fit and more well-trained aerobically. Man, that just felt good, Helms. That was like going back to like just that's the sweet spot of like sport nutrition, exercise physiology, just
Oh, nice. You crushed
foundational
it.
concept.
And if
Yeah.
you don't mind, this is actually a topic I like because there are some robust opportunities to give students light bulb moments.
Mm.
Because the way that energy systems and fuel utilization are typically taught, they give the impression to students as they're learning physiology that there are distinct categories when there aren't, and it leads to some misinterpretations. And not a lot, a handful of the fitness myths we have out there are relying on that, and they've been perpetuated by some of the big companies that produce like the little infographics that are on your treadmill that say, hey, here's the fat burning zone. So one of the key things that I like to do when I have the opportunity to talk about this in front of like a room of students is ask them the question of, okay, so when do we use these energy systems? And they start to rattle off like, okay, we use the stored ATP that exists in the first 4 seconds. Then we start to use the ATP-CP system up to the next 10 seconds. And then we're starting to get into, the lactic acid or the glycolytic system. And then eventually we're in the aerobic system. And I go, no, we're using them always, all the time. And especially when it comes to the oxidative or the aerobic system, depending upon what generation of terminology you want to use, that is always going all the time, even when your intensity goes up a lot. And they go, oh, so it's basically like, all right, the more you create an energy demand right now, the more ATP recycling necessity you need. So creating a high density of work, the more all of the systems are going to ramp up to try to meet that demand. And there are simply speed limitations, which I think is a useful way of framing these energy systems as to how quickly they can turn over ATP, requiring some of these arguably less efficient systems, the more immediate demand systems, because they don't produce as much ATP, but they can do it faster to come on board. And meaning that if you sustain that high recycling ATP need, basically a higher intensity, those essentially can't continue to meet the demand because they quote unquote run out. They don't really run out, but they just can't continually meet that demand. They got depleted, and then you are forced to recycle ATP at a slower rate, aka bonking, and you're going to see a shift in substrate utilization. But the interesting thing, what I really like to point out to people, is that as you increase intensity, the first thing that students think of is, oh, I'm going to be using more ATP, more ATP-CP, and maybe if I keep going, I'll dig into that lactic system, which is a glycolytic system, right? You will also see an increase in demand of the aerobic system, the oxidative system. It maxes out. So that means the higher the intensity, the more absolute fat you're actually burning.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Which is something people forget because they're thinking about the relative contribution of carbohydrate and fat. Because when you max out intensity, everybody's coming to the party. You think of it as trying to overcome the inertia, and you're pushing a car that's engine is stopped or it's stuck in the mud. If there's that little kid who can run forever, but he doesn't run that fast because he's got little short legs, he's still helping. Thank you, Timmy. You're not helping that much, but you are still pushing on the car. And in fact, he's always pushing on the car. Salute to Timmy. So I think
Timmy.
that's important to understand. If you look at some of these great graphs out there, and I was searching on my phone for one for people to see.
Beautiful.
You can see that there's a ramp up in that kind of low amplitude aerobic system at the bottom there that happens, and that happens as you increase intensity. So it's doing its best. It just cannot meet the turnover demand. So you're forced to fall into a lower intensity bracket as far as the actual exercise, and there's going to be a commensurate change in substrate utilization based upon that and which systems you've depleted. So hopefully that is helpful in addition to what you said, Trex.
Absolutely. Good stuff. All right, let's keep it moving along here. Hello from Santa Cruz. Appreciate you, Tina. She's one of the heroes. She's here.
Always here.
Every week. Someone rooting for the Waterloo Warriors. Helms, where's Waterloo? Is that in Canada?
Waterloo?
Or is that in the Midwest?
I mean, we have Google for this so that we don't make fools of ourselves.
I feel like Waterloo's in Canada.
Waterloo sounds like Canada.
Yeah. And the Warriors, I assume, are a football team there. That's my set of assumptions. But I tell you what are you getting, Helms? You're very surprised.
The Waterloo campaign, which was fought between the French Army of the North
that was
and
Napoleon, right?
Coalition. Exactly.
Yeah.
That was in the Netherlands. We're probably not talking about that.
Yeah.
So not the one in Belgium, I think is what we're...
So when he says the Waterloo Warriors, I assume he doesn't mean Napoleon and his cronies. But who knows?
Which is exactly what I Googled, and there you go.
All right. We'll get to the bottom of that later, but we got a more pressing issue here. What health concerns are there when heating up food in the microwave in Tupperware? I prep my food in the beginning of the week, and I reheat in plastic containers throughout the week. Honestly, this is another one where I frankly don't have a ton of knowledge. And I mean, Helms, do you have any? I'm sure as someone who really specializes in bodybuilding coaching, there is at least some kind of consensus among the people who historically live out of massive stacks of Tupperware. Yeah.
Yeah, the general consensus is get glass or Pyrex, because I looked at this research sometime a decade and a half ago and that's mildly concerning. I don't want to dig into it, but there's a viable alternative, so just do that and quit bothering me.
Yeah, that's where I fell with it. Was like, and like honestly, then there's also the question of like, to some extent, as evidence-based as you want to be, when it comes to like whenever they're coming out with new materials, new production methods, it's like it might take us a minute before we have the research to really dig into it and figure out, okay, like, is this cool for reheating none at all? Or is it cool for reheating for 2 years and then it starts wearing down and leaching into your food? Is it cool for reheating in the microwave, but not if you're putting it in the lower drawer or the lower portion of your dishwasher and you're doing it wrong? For all those different reasons, I actually, to be honest, just didn't care for many years. So I just did it. So if you're concerned, hey, we're in the same boat. We'll figure this out as we go.
Can I make a meta comment about this?
Sure.
Okay. I remember the most flack we've ever taken as mass, unfortunately, fell on your shoulders.
Whoa.
Trex.
Wow.
It's true. And this is when you dared to point out that something Andrew Huberman said was repeated a whole bunch and was eventually false, and that he did not do a good job of correcting the record after the study that was based upon what he said was retracted. And it created a meta conversation about retractions. And there was a rash of commentary about how we were just doing gotcha commentary. I want to point out that some folks who remind me of Huberman, and I'm not going to say this is, no, screw it. I'm going to be the next recipient of the hate.
Yeah.
Andrew Huberman, I think, is a great example of someone who seems to have an answer for all of these questions. Maybe not live on the air, maybe it'd be a little different, but he probably has content about plastics, nasal breathing, and maybe some other question that we're going to get in the chat. And I totally get it. The fact that we're getting these questions, I take as an indirect compliment, because you think there's a chance we might know the answer.
Yeah.
And it also indicates that you give us a certain level of trust, and that if we gave you an answer and it sounded plausible, you'd probably believe it. And if we spent maybe 2 minutes finding some study, we could even make it sound plausible upon an initial Google search. But the likelihood of us being wrong would be much higher than, say, for example, the answer we gave about energy systems, because we both have PhDs in exercise science. Now, someone else who, let's say, I don't know, has a PhD in neuroscience could do the same thing, but would also not have studied nasal breathing, nor would they have studied the migration of plastics due to high heat levels in a microwave and the subsequent health effects. But their answer would have just as high of a probability as being wrong. So this is a useful opportunity for you to look at the people who you are following and go, maybe there's no such thing as someone who is a general expert, and that might even be some type of an implausibility. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who know a whole heck of a lot and are right more often than not about those things. But most of the time, when you have someone who has a PhD, which means they did a deep dive on a very, very specific topic, giving you answers on everything, there might be some, at the very least, inadvertent ignorance going on, if not some ego, if not some actual full-blown charlatanry going on. So be careful, folks.
Wow. And I tell you what, if you wanted to know who is most likely to develop something that is reminiscent, even just drifting in the general vicinity of being this kind of oxymoronic generalist expert, it would be someone who publishes a research review every month for like 7 years, right? Because you are going to, on a month-to-month basis, select a few topics which just eventually will be novel. And you will have to dig into that topic with enough focus over the course of about 28 days to really develop a strong feeling of that literature to present an evidence-based answer in written form. However, you and I both do that, and we haven't turned over every rock related to health, wellness, fitness. And so I think that we are nowhere close to being a generalist expert, or either of us being that. And that's...
I'd say you're closer.
Because
I'd say you're closer.
I've been I've been drifting into different territories, responsibly, carefully, cautiously,
and purposefully. And I purposefully do the opposite. So yes, while we do have a research review, for the longest time, it was titled Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. And then kicking and screaming, I've allowed us to become just Mass Research Review to apply to a broader audience. But because there's 4 of us, and I don't need to be anyone else other than who I am, and I curmudgeonly refuse to, we have a monthly journal sweep that 2 of my amazing PhD students contribute to, and they go through a bunch of journals to figure out what's in there. I go into that Excel document. What do you think the first thing I do is, Trex?
What? You Control F bodybuilding?
My man.
Yeah.
But I do a few. I do Control F body B because it could be body, or body build because it could be bodybuilding. It could be bodybuilders. And then I also do Control F physique with a Q to make sure physique athletes pop up. And then I do Control F weight L for weightlifting, weightlifters. And then I do Control F power L for powerlifting, powerlifters. That compromises the 90% chance of what I'm going to cover that month. And if nothing pops up, then I go, God damn it. And then I do Control F hypertrophy, and I do Control F body comp, and I see what comes up.
Well, you would have been screwed back in 2017 when, was it 2017 when Helms and colleagues published that really great paper, Prep and Recovery in about 40-something female athletes?
I would have been screwed, except I was a co-author on that paper.
Well, there you go. Because they called them, I think, fitness competitors. I don't think they used bodybuilding or physique in the title, which is, this is a public service announcement to make Helms' life easier. Folks, don't be doing that.
Yep.
Don't be doing that.
Thank you.
And the person who asked this question, they followed up, and they said, I don't Google search because I know just because a study says blank, or I'll find a headline saying that may not be true. So this individual's doing it the right way, saying, hey, I know some folks who may know this, right? And that is a completely appropriate thing to do. Like, I mean, you guys saw it happen in real time. If you're watching right now, I was like, well, I don't know about this, but I feel like Helms must have looked into this at some point. And the reasoning for that is like sheer volume of coaching, right? You've worked with so many people who are physique athletes, I'm like, clearly you got to have something in your back pocket that you at least say, right? And it could be, I don't know.
I have a memory that I used to know that it was something worthwhile to look into, that I looked into, that I thought, I don't have the materials nor the physiology knowledge. I'm neither a cancer epidemiologist nor am I a materials expert to understand this. But this is published in a Q1 journal. It's relatively well ranked. These authors look legit. They're concerned. You know what? Get some Pyrex. So
Yeah.
that's the extent of it, right?
Well, and now they're saying Helms. I'm using
Do I
the
need to Google
they.
Pyrex? Son of a
Well,
bitch.
no. Now they're saying that the headline that's going around is that we all have enough microplastics in our body right now to make like a credit card, which I don't like.
Let's
So
go.
who knows how that factors into this whole Tupperware equation? I know people are now saying, to worry about that with like the cutting boards that are the kind of like
Mhm.
really
Yeah.
hard plastic. But you look at it and you see there's divots and cuts in it. So anyway, now we are just saying, hey, there's all this stuff we don't know, you and me, about plastics. So,
Subscription rates are dropping.
yeah.
What are we doing?
You know what? Not this month, but in a future month, I think I actually want to tackle this. I think I want to dig into it and see if I feel comfortable enough with the state of the science to opine on it. And folks, you'll know how that goes because there will either be an article or there won't.
Amazing.
Yeah, but no, I think this is the right thing to do. For the person who asked this in the chat is think, okay, who do I trust will give me a robust, rigorous answer? And you do want that to be someone who will, on occasion, tell you, I'm not really sure, but here's how I approach it because I also make this decision.
Trex, do you think it would be worthwhile discussing our basic process of how we go about writing or learning about something that is outside of our expertise in order to have the lowest probability of getting it wrong?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, do you have an answer to that? And I can think of mine.
Oh, of course.
Okay.
I only pitch myself softballs.
Yeah. So how do you go about doing that?
So I mentioned a little bit before. I have a couple of different things that I like to do. So one is I will try to find a high impact journal in a given field, and I will try to find some researchers on a systematic review, position stand, or umbrella review that have written about a given topic, and that has something that I can track back and see that multiple other systematic reviews have been written on it, so that at the very least I know that the general consensus on this topic from these experts in this field is X, Y, and Z. Now that does take a little bit of knowledge. If you don't know what a Q1 or Q2 journal is, if you don't know how to search for that, you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what an impact factor is. This is a little more challenging to do. This is something that I get as a tangential skill from being just an academic, right? So I can kind of get that face value. Now, there are weaknesses to this approach because just like I currently know some things that are the consensus belief in exercise science, which are actually being questioned, and that does move a little bit slower, you could end up being wrong, but you won't be any more wrong than the general consensus is, which I think is a useful approach. The version of that is useful to someone who is not an academic and doesn't have those skills would be to look for position stands from specific academic/practitioner organizations. So the International Society of Sports Nutrition, so the GISSN, or the American Council on Sports Medicine, ACSM, or the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Their position stands that have come out, as long as they're relatively recent, I'd say probably no more than, say, 5 years old. Those are great places to look, and they essentially are comprised of a systematic review of members of the organization, and they tend to be a watered down version of our best take because we don't want to get anything wrong, and they're heavily peer reviewed and debated internally. So that's a great place to look if you want to get an idea in kind of the health and fitness realm. A second step that I will take is often I know someone in my network who I can at least identify is an academic and an expert in that field, or who knows someone. and I will try to get in contact with them and give them a, hey, here's my impression of the literature. Where am I off base, or what are some of the things I don't know that I don't know? So those are a couple key steps. And some of the things I definitely don't do is go straight to social media, or just go straight to a Google search. I'll use Google Scholar, I'll use PubMed, and that's pretty much the extent of that. And then from there, I will also use my personal network. Because if you use just a general Google search, like I said, or you use social media, what's often going to happen is you'll kind of get the pseudoscientific generalized belief. And folks, I know everyone in here, you've been burned more times than that's been helpful. Most of the pop science stuff is at best partially right, but insufficiently nuanced. And it is very challenging. There's what's called the bullshit asymmetry principle, where it's very easy to generate something that sounds truthy, that takes hold, that is anywhere from completely wrong to right enough to be dangerous. And then actually correcting the record takes exponentially more time and effort, and is far less successful. And there's actually published research looking at how hard it is, and that it takes people a certain willingness, a certain level of processing power or general intelligence, and like I said, the willingness to actually apply it to have misinformation corrected. And there's actually recent research I was looking at that even when you do correct it, there seems to be these lingering beliefs because of how long the prior knowledge was held, that people kind of default to when they're not actively cognitively thinking. So it's a pretty tough conundrum to deal with. But anyway, that is my approach.
Yeah, and the lingering beliefs thing is hard because some element of that is just, the idea gets sticky, it gets solidified, it kind of perpetuates itself. Another element is sometimes people will believe, sometimes for, with motivated reasoning, like, oh, the truth came out originally and they didn't like it. So they went back and retracted it because of, politics and BS and technicalities and shadowy influence and things of that nature. So yeah, once a thing has come out, people say, as of right now, that's fact, and facts don't become undone. And so, even if this gets retracted, I'm going to assume that, it was some BS kind of everybody ganged up on them because they didn't like the result. So yeah, good, great point. And my approach is similar now that you lay it out. That I will reiterate, I really, for things that are way out of my scope, I do enjoy the good position stand from a reputable professional organization or governmental task force bureau, etc. Those aren't perfect, and you do have to do your due diligence with that, because I was actually kind of I don't get too bent out of shape, but I was surprised. One might say annoyed, but I think I was just more surprised. But I took a graduate level course at a very highly ranked university, and in that course we referenced some materials put out by a professional organization, and later I came to find that this professional organization was not considered reliable by experts in the field. It was like a propaganda group that had a bunch of fringe ideas. And they duped my professor. And my professor then made that part of a PhD level curriculum at like literally a top 35 university in the United States. Like a really reputable, like it was, yeah, that was eye opening to me, because I was like, whoa, now I need to like really take an extra look at some of these professional because that's the thing. If you're an outsider to that field, then you also don't know who do the legit researchers in this area consider to be a reputable professional organization, right? And in fitness, like, and I'm not going to mention any names, but like even in fitness, you can think of if this group put out a position stand, I would take it seriously. If that group did, I don't really care, right? Like so yeah, it's tricky. And there's no quick easy solution for this. That's like a one size fits all approach. And I mean, we've talked at length in the mass research review, mostly me, to be fair, about
Mm-hmm.
how back in the day you would just say, oh, go find a meta-analysis, whatever that says. And now it's like, no way. Like there's a lot of bad
Yeah.
meta-analyses out there. So yeah, I agree with you, but also would caution people, you have to kind of layer these techniques, do your due diligence, and say, okay, if I can find, a few smart scientists who say that organization is good, that organization has a robust stance on this that seems to be supported by a systematic review of the literature, and there's a decent amount of literature that even exists, now I'm feeling great, right? But when those stars don't align, then you have to, you know, go with what you got. But yeah, so when it comes to the initial question about plastic, it's like one one of the reasons that I
There was an initial question.
yeah, one of the reasons that I think it's good to bring these questions up, even if we don't know the answer definitively, is because you still got to you have to formulate
Gotta do
a
something.
position moving forward, right? You will be eating and you will be transporting food. What do you use? I do think it's telling that you and I both at some point looked into this for about 30 seconds and said, I don't know, but like, I'll go with the glass, right? So that
Yep.
is where we are, but it is not the type of thing where when I see someone heating up a Tupperware, I look at them and say, what are you doing?
You're gonna die
Please,
tomorrow.
like, yeah, I don't knock it out of their hand and say you'll thank me in 60 years. So it's one of those things where you have to make a decision, but the question is, how strongly do you feel about that decision? And for me, it's better safe than sorry. What do I care? I don't enjoy the food more out of plastic than glass. So hopefully there is something useful to be to be found in this diversion. But Helms, we got to buckle down.
Let's
Okay.
do it. Fast
Because
responses. I'm ready.
I'm
Lightning
not
round.
allowed to eat after 10 p.m. and I want to get some food in my belly. Okay.
Let's do it.
So going through here, someone mentioned we don't have enough likes. I agree. Get on that, folks. Someone mentioned that they changed the layout. So now you can actually see the like button. It looks like a thumb up. So make sure you click on that. Got confirmation. Waterloo, the Warriors are in Canada. Love to hear that.
Doing our job for us.
Absolutely. Someone mentioning that they're rooting for Michigan State in football. I'm okay with that. Yeah, that is, if you're going to root for a team in Michigan, that's the one I would go with. So good for you. Someone
Do you want my
asked,
take on the football?
what's that?
Do you want my take on the football?
Do you have one?
Yeah.
Okay.
There should be a correction score for how many players on your team got the most reps with a 225 on bench. And that should be applied. That is my only take.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm curious to see how long that persists as the combine strength metric. I'm not sure if I designed an NFL combine, if I would say, hey, I want to know if you got 39 reps on the bench or 31. But hey, to each their own. And if you want to make that a bigger part of the sport, then that is a decision.
I would say it's the only interesting part of the sport, personally.
Yeah.
So
Okay. There is something interesting about a man who weighs 330 pounds that can run 40 yards in under 5 seconds. That will be perpetually interesting to me. But moving on. We have a question here. Any major issue to using a Smith machine as a vertical leg press in a home gym for hypertrophy, working with limited equipment and can't fit a traditional leg press? Helms, I'm not sure how you feel about this. I wouldn't do it because I would feel like I was laying under a guillotine. I know people have done it. I know people used to do it more often than they do now. I wouldn't do it, but how do you feel?
I think there's a reason why we have safety stoppers, which come with Smith machines, and you should absolutely use them. I will also put forth that depending upon your hip structure and mobility, the range of motion you're going to get lying flat on your back and trying to do a leg press is going to be anywhere from not great to terrible. And there are some really great options you can do with the Smith machine, like Smith machine squats. And because it is a fixed plane and bar path, you can do some other cool things with it, like elevate your heels a bit. You can get some nice wedges and you can lean back into the bar, and you can get a very nice knee dominant squat.
Like a hack squat kind of
Yes,
feeling.
exactly.
Yeah.
Some even called these cyclist squats. I don't actually know where that ideology came from, but I have actually recently ordered some wedges myself, and they're built as such that there's a very, very small wedge, and then you can double them up and get a large wedge. And my advice, though, however, is that if you're going to start doing wedged Smith machine squats, and barbell medicine, don't at me, but there does seem to be a correlation between jumping too quickly. So this is more a workload thing rather than a movement thing. So I will not be added.
So don't jump.
Jumping,
Okay.
exactly. Going all the way just from I'm normally doing flat-footed, kind of typical balanced, normal, quote unquote, squats to, all right, leaning back, knees forward, knees over toes, squats. Oh, a little bit more knee discomfort. To doing that with squat shoes, to doing that with squat shoes on a small wedge, to doing those with squat shoes on a big wedge, and basically getting completely vertical and just having your knees coming really far forward. Rushing that process can cause some discomfort, so I would recommend doing it in stages. So, for example, knowing that my wedges were on the way, most recently in my last leg workout, transitioning from leg press to these Smith machine kind of style hack squats, I just came in and I wore a nice heel lift and I put my knees forward. Next time I do that, I will actually wear a flat-footed sole and I'll wear the low wedge. The next time, I'll wear my squat shoe on top of the low wedge. The next time, flat foot on top of the high wedge. And eventually, if I need and I feel I need to get there, if I can get more range of motion about the knee and it's not already sufficient, I might even go squat shoes on a high ledge. But I'm not just going straight from like low bar squat to double wedge, knees forward, lean back, squat shoe. So that would probably be something I would transition to.
Awesome. I like it. Yeah, and the safeties do exist. That is true. But I think more to the point, like you were saying, there are a lot of really great options for what you can do with a Smith machine. So it's kind of not just the risk of it, but also we could get probably an even better stimulus several different ways, So I'm with
Machine
you.
Bulgarians are also great.
Oh, yeah. Those are nasty. All right. So Ian says, I'm in prep, and for 1 week, I have to have my morning weigh-in 3 hours earlier than normal. Will that have an effect on my average body weight?
Yes.
Yeah. So what do you think they should do about that, Helms?
I would argue that in general, during prep, you shouldn't be making decisions on a 1 week time scale anyway. If you really wanted to be pedantic and crazy about this, you could just see the difference in weight when you are not eating, because you will actually lose weight just from breathing. You're losing moisture in the air. Personally, for me, noting that I'm a man over 40, it is the rare night, and it probably means I was slightly dehydrated throughout the day, where I'm not waking up sometime about 2 to 3 hours before my normal wake time, stumbling into our bathroom, peeing, and then going back to sleep. And the disparity between not only just breathing for another 3 hours and losing moisture that way, but also having one urination, that can actually amount to about 2 or 3 pounds in a guy who weighs a little over 200. So you could just try to figure out what the rough correction factor would be and do that if you want. But I would advise just like take a week off weighing in and then just pick up back where you are. That's what personally I would do. I don't think I'm gaining anything by figuring out like a quote unquote correction factor and then going through it. I would just be like, all right, you know what? I'm going to see where things are at the week prior, looking at 2 weeks of data. Am I on a good trajectory? Awesome. Nothing's going to change that much in a week that you'll lose a substantial amount of forward momentum or progress in fat loss by keeping things the same for another week.
Yeah, cool. Got a question here about the constrained energy hypothesis. And the question is, curious about the intersection of energy flux and the constrained energy hypothesis. How do you reconcile the two? I don't think that there's a need to necessarily reconcile them, but I do think that energy flux, in a very broad sense, can describe different applications of constrained energy expenditure. So, for example, our current understanding, which is still in development, is that energy constraint or, exercise energy compensation seems to be observed in the largest magnitudes when there is a shortfall of energy intake. And so you could see that in a low energy flux situation, such as I am on a weight loss diet, intentionally under fueling, and trying to do a whole bunch of steps to keep my activity level high. So we could see a glimpse of that exercise energy compensation in a relatively low flux state, so to speak. We could also see it in a preposterously high flux state. And it has been observed with really reliable measurements in this case. So, for example, people who are doing Race Across America, where they run literally across North America, doing approximately a marathon a day for a very long time, they are literally unable to fuel enough to maintain their body weight during that process. And so they are in an energy deficit with tremendously high energy flux. And again, we see that there is pretty substantial, pretty considerable exercise energy compensation. Now, what's interesting is that we don't see as extreme energy compensation when you're fueling enough to kind of make your energy budget work. And there's more work to be done here, but that, again, could occur in a low or high energy flux state. There are some just workloads where chronically it's just very unlikely that you're going to be able to replace calories. Like it's just really hard to do. Usually that ends up being, if you're trying to eat more than 2.5 times your basal metabolic rate, that seems to be where people pretty much tap out, especially in conjunction with really high volumes and by extension, high durations of exercise. So yeah, we can observe this in low or high energy flux situations, but the real question is, how high is the activity level, and to what extent is there a shortfall of dietary energy coming in? And when we see that combination of super high physical activity plus really large deficit, that's where we start to see the most extreme glimpses at this constrained model kind of bearing out in the data. Got some happy anniversary comments in the chat. Love to see it. Javier was asking if they could float a question about some research they were planning to do for their dissertation, PhD dissertation. Ooh. Helms, for the Europeans who call that a thesis.
Aussies and New Zealanders too.
Correct. And Javier was a little concerned because I think he was mentioning in a different question that his is a little bit behavior focused. He was wondering if any of us dummies know anything about health behavior. And Helms, you've published in that area. You've got I would say you have a strong background in that area. And this has become more and more an area of focus for me in terms of, habits and health behaviors. I'm basically working with a bunch of sociologists in my job who study the kind of sociology and psychology of health behavior. So yes, be sure to let us know what you're thinking, and we'd be happy to chat about it. Okay, so we got a question here. Someone said we would be in their MySpace top 8 for sure.
Oh,
that is awesome. Yeah, if you're
is it Tom? When you join MySpace, he messages you and be like, "Hey, welcome!" And he's your first friend. Am I remembering that correctly?
Tom
from MySpace.
I don't know if he sent a message. He definitely was like. Well, yeah, I don't believe that he was sitting there.
It was a different time, Trex.
Yeah, that's true. But he definitely kind of started out as your first default friend. That is definitely the case. All right, but we got a question here about fitness. When programming supersets involving some of the same, there's Tom for the young folks who don't know what we're talking about. If you are programming supersets involving some of the same muscles, so for example, dumbbell bench press and cable tricep extensions, would there be a pre-fatiguing component to be concerned about? So we're talking about, a superset that involves, starting out with, basically one of them is targeting a muscle that is involved with the first exercise, right? So Zordos has written about supersets all the time, many times in the Mass Research Review. And generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that the kind of preferred approach with supersets is either to select two exercises that involve completely different muscle groups, or kind of a special case of that is two exercises that involve directly opposing muscle groups. So, for example, a chest movement, a back movement, a bicep movement, a tricep movement. And my understanding is that the pre-fatigue component, or kind of the overlapping fatigue, that cumulative impact is definitely part of why we prefer to kind of separate out those supersets. Anything to add to that, Helms?
Yes, and I think the accurate view of this is it's not just Zerdos, all right? So don't try to give him too much credit. He already takes way more than his share. Is that we've been on a baton relay race, him and I. I started with the sensible superset, is what I described, the antagonist paired set, and he's carried on. And actually, this coming issue, October 1st, I'm reviewing some recent research on it. But no, that's an accurate view overall. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back and think conceptually here about when is it beneficial or not to have that quote unquote pre-fatiguing effect. And here we can look to some related research. Okay. We've actually had two recent meta-analyses come out on drop sets. Now, why the heck are drop sets even relevant to supersets? Because it's the same concept, right? You're taking minimal rest and you're doing another set for the same muscle group, and you're trying to keep training, and it's time efficient, right? One of the interesting findings when looking at these drop sets is that you can get equivalent outcomes in less time, outcomes being hypertrophy, but you're losing the per set efficiency or the per set stimulus efficiency. So overall, when you look at this body of research, it requires, to get the equivalent of 10 straight sets on a given exercise, you would have to do roughly 13 sets of drop sets, including the first kind of initial set. So if you were to do exclusively drop set training, you would have to do 30% more training to get the same amount. Of course, it's more than 30% time efficient. A single series of drop sets where you do one activation set and 3 drops is going to take less time than 2 straight sets. So you're still winning out on time efficiency, even if you're losing in terms of the efficiency of the stimulus per set. What the heck does that have to do with supersets? You could probably anticipate something similar. And the reason being is you're losing on the actual stimulus, the actual impulse, if we were to talk physics, the area under the curve, force times time integral. This could be expressed in volume load, right? You're either doing less reps with the same load, or you're having to drop the load to maintain the same reps. You're getting less total volume load when you're doing a superset and you're creating that pre-fatiguing stimulus. And just like the research we have on rest periods, where you can make up for the loss of hypertrophy stimulus from having too short of a rest interval by then doing additional sets to then get back to a similar volume load, you can get that same thing with supersets. You can get that same thing with drop sets. You can get that same thing with just short rest intervals, right? So generally, the reason why we recommend peripheral or antagonist paired sets, where you're basically doing a superset with 2 exercises which don't train the same muscle group, is that you're getting the benefit of both worlds. There's no crossover in terms of the muscle being trained, so the fatigue is, if anything, minor because it's just systemic or cardiorespiratory, and you're also saving time because you're resting after both exercises rather than just one. So long as you're in sufficient cardiorespiratory shape, this is a win-win. You're saving time and you're not seeing that loss of stimulus efficiency because you're not seeing a drop-off in reps or load. The only downside, and I'm going to be reviewing this, like I said, October 1st, mass issue comes out, read all about it, is that the perceived exertion is a bit higher when you're doing supersets because you're just simply packing in more metabolic work in a smaller time window. So hopefully that answers the question, Trex, and why we generally don't recommend doing supersets of the same muscle group. But you can, if you're pressured for time, just be aware that any loss in volume, if you don't make up for it, is probably also a comparative loss in stimulus.
Definitely. We got a question here from, so in a body recomp study, should the participants, who in this case are untrained, stay at maintenance calories throughout, or should they be in a slight deficit? So I would argue if they're recomping, this is probably what's happening here with this question is kind of a common misconception. And so a lot of folks say, should they stay at maintenance, meaning body weight stays the same? And in reality, when someone's recomping, and Menno Henselmans has a really good article talking about this on his website, but when someone's recomping, they are simultaneously gaining muscle and losing fat. And, that the process of building that muscle, there's going to be some net increase in energy to the body system in order to make that happen. There's a certain energy content of new muscle. But the fact that a person is losing fat means there's also some net energy that's leaving the body, right? And so when we're determining if someone is in a deficit or a surplus, what we're looking at is from point A to point B, how many calories is their body worth if, heaven forbid, we put them in a bomb calorimeter, right? Which is not recommended. But that's basically what we're talking about. There's this thing here. Does this thing have more energy or less energy than it used to? What is the net balance? And so a lot of people would say, well, my maintenance calories are what keep my body weight stable. But not really, because if you gain a pound of muscle, lose a pound of fat, you were in a deficit, but your body weight didn't change, okay? So in terms of what ought to be happening during a recomp study, kind of depends on what your research question is, because recomping could happen in a way that's weight stable. Recomping could happen with weight loss occurring during it. And there are some instances, not as common, but it is theoretically possible for recomping to occur as weight gain is happening. And it's more common to see the other direction, but that is a possibility when you start crunching the numbers of the actual net change in body energy. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit.
And I'll make a minor aside, because there is some time points when this confuses people. One thing, just a general comment, most of the time people talk about body recomp and refer to the research. The research is not explicitly set out to answer a question about body recomp. They simply observed it. Yeah. Really important point for that person. So anytime you're listening to people talking about body recomposition research, they're talking about research which included measurements of body composition where body recomposition occurred, which just means the simultaneous loss of fat mass and the simultaneous gain of lean mass. It's also worth pointing out that the measurement matters, because if you gain 2 kilograms of lean mass and have no change in fat mass, and they report body fat percentage, it will go down, because the same amount of fat mass is now a smaller proportion of your body as you've increased total body mass by 2 kilos and lean body mass by 2 kilos. And you could call that body recomposition. You did get leaner by the typical metric we use to determine leanness, body fat percentage, but you did not actually lose fat mass.
Mm. Yeah, and the net energy of your body went up in that process.
Positive.
Yeah,
exactly. So you're in a surplus.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's. We are short on time here because I need to eat a bunch of stuff before my surgery, and I don't want to go past my time limit. So thanks to everyone for the well wishes. I saw at least one instance in the chat. Appreciate it. I'm going to come back stronger, better than ever. I'm in good health. This is purely a orthopedic type deal where we're just trying to make my body feel better and work better. No imminent danger. So let's see here. Oh, someone asked a question about like how long are you really in a plateau? Something along those lines. And if so, what's the process for troubleshooting your training? For that individual, I have good news. We've got about 52 episodes of Mass Office Hours, free of charge for your viewing pleasure or listening pleasure, whatever you prefer. And I know that we've covered that, but I don't remember which episode. I know that I believe, Helms, at some point you have talked through your process for kind of troubleshooting things and your process for how you go about adding volume and things like that. I'm certain that at least on one occasion I've had a conversation with Zordos about, how to figure out when you're in a plateau and how to troubleshoot it. So if you are willing to invest a little bit of time to dig through the archives, you will find discussions of that nature. And guess what? You're probably going to find other gems that you weren't even looking for. And you're going to say, wow, that was fantastic. So the downside of having done this every single episode, 53rd time in a row, is I forget when we did each individual topic, but it's in there somewhere, ready for you to view.
Yeah, and actually we did a duo iron culture episode where we talked a lot about this, although if you search for the topic, it wouldn't come up as the first thing you'd think. And it was specifically us talking about how we conceive the minimum effective training dose, if you remember that, and how we talked about offsetting the reduction in the rate of gains that one makes. And that was, do advanced lifters need more volume? And that's episode 287 of the Iron Culture podcast, where we talk about that. And we talk about how things change when you move from novice to intermediate to advanced, and what that means in terms of practice and how we perceive plateaus.
Good people over there at Iron Culture. I love that show.
I've heard good things about him.
I love that show. Someone said Helms is giving Arnold vibes with his arms and pecs. We're getting trolled.
No. This is someone is definitely going to ask me for money, and guess what? I'll probably give it to you after that comment. So.
Yep, absolutely. Helms, one sentence answer. Okay.
Done. Biggest run-on sentence ever incoming.
Bro science concept that anterior delts get enough stimulus from compound pressing, so you don't need isolation for them. How true is that? Do you need
totally
isolation for anterior?
No, not unless you have actually demonstrated that is a weak point for your physique, and then you could do isolation work, semicolon. I would recommend doing some type of cable work in a lengthened position, because dumbbell front raises are really not training them that effectively until you get into a shortened position.
Okay, follow-up question. What if the only pressing involved is chest-oriented pressing? So incline, flat, decline, no overhead pressing. Still, most people will be fine without that isolation work.
Yes. If you think about the position of the delt at the bottom of almost any pressing, even decline, it's still relatively stretched and in probably a better position than you would get from doing like a dumbbell front raise. And I think, semicolon, and I think that's when you're comparing the various exercises people use to train their anterior delts, the front delt dumbbell raise is worse than almost any press when you think about it objectively, about the position, the point of tension, etc.
Oh boy, we're getting a flood of comments. Your arms are noticeably bigger, says a commenter. This is getting out of hand. Another one-word answer here. Helms, one word. Have you ever used the Consensus app?
No.
Neither have I. Well, there you go. Someone asked if we liked it. We have no opinion because we haven't used it. I'm insisting. Okay, let's see here. Someone asked about specializing in a single muscle group, wondering if that would give them like just the ultimate optimal results for that muscle that's being trained if they intentionally didn't train anything else. I would say you don't need to not train other groups to get that optimal stimulus. And if anything, you're going to end up in a pretty nasty cycle of spinning your wheels where you ultra train one muscle group and then let it detrain when you move to all the others, and you're going to be playing whack-a-mole with your specialization phases. Helms, any disagreement on that one?
No, I would just say briefly, theoretically, the desire and the demand of potentially optimizing overall development by doing alternating specialization cycles comes from the fact that the required stimulus and dose you need to give to all muscle groups saps your overall recuperative capacities. And that happens at far more advanced stages of training. It's not something that is just a default thing that applies to everyone, because the threshold for making really good gains on most muscle groups is low in intermediates and novice, so you don't really need to do that in the first place.
Cool. We got a question here. Doing a back or a pull focused workout, any issues if I start every back workout with a vertical pull rather than switching up between doing a vertical pull first and a horizontal pull first in other workouts? Any possibility that the horizontal musculature is not going to be getting enough stimulation? Personally, I wouldn't worry about it. I think you're fine starting out with a vertical pull. I do whatever you're most comfortable with. I mix it up sometimes just purely based on when I walk in the gym, what I feel like. That's about as scientific as I get about it. Helms, based on the shaking of head, it sounds like you're generally on the same page there.
Yep.
Okay, I'll do it. I don't want to do it, but I will indulge one question about training at long muscle lengths.
Let's
I
go.
will do one. I'll do one. Do reverse Nordics train all heads of the quads at long muscle lengths?
So, that is a good question. So when you think about muscles, there are monoarticular and biarticular. Okay. So a biarticular muscle crosses two joints. A monoarticular only crosses one. So a monoarticular muscle is only going to be stretched more when you create more range of motion about the single joint it crosses. Okay. So a reverse Nordic is useful because it is not only isolated knee extension, so the rectus femoris is going to participate while it normally doesn't in forms of squats, because you're also doing hip extension, which opposes its hip flexion action, but also because you are leaned back into the position of hip extension. Your hip is straight. You're not in kind of a seated position like you would be on a leg extension, if we're going to compare a leg extension to a Nordic. So by leaning back, you are going to be lengthening the muscles that cross the hip, and that is only the rectus femoris. So the degree of stretch that is placed upon the vasti muscle groups, the vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis, is going to be, they're only going to be stretched based upon the degrees of knee flexion. Now, because a reverse Nordic actually has you in a position where your calf is directly underneath your hamstring, you're seated in a kneeling position, that is typically more knee flexion than you would get in your typical knee extension exercise, okay? And because you are leaned back all the way, the lever arm is longest when you're in that initial starting position. So it is a high level of tension on the muscles that cross the knee and the hip, in the case of the rectus femoris, at the beginning of the movement, and you're in a high degree of knee flexion. So it does train all the muscle groups at a longer position, but the important point is it has nothing to do for the vasti muscles with the degree of hip flexion, only the degree of knee flexion.
All right, good stuff. I was a good sport. I let you do your thing, and now we put you back on the shelf for a couple weeks, and when you come back, you get one more. Okay?
Okay, deal.
All right, Helms, one last question I want to address here before we go. I'm relying on your memory for this one.
Okay.
The question is, can we get a constrained energy model episode on iron culture? What do you remember the name? There was one, it was like a unified theory of metabolic adaptation or something like that.
That's literally it.
Yeah, so Nathaniel Helms is doing rigorous research. We're going to hook you up with an episode number. And so what you're looking for likely exists. And if that episode doesn't cover what you're looking for or doesn't scratch the itch, then we'll see you back on office hours.
Also, episode 243, exercise energy compensation. It's not just about calories, featuring Eric Trexler. In addition to the unified theory of metabolic adaptation, and even going further than that, there's an episode on cardio that is just me giving probably less accurate takes because it's older, and I am the inferior Eric when it comes to the topic of the constrained model of energy expenditure, because I am not playing golf with Herman Ponzer every weekend like you.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, even my content on the topic, I would refer people to the newer episodes where I've discussed it, just because an interesting thing about Herman Ponzer is that you do absorb some of this information just by being around him, not through hearing it or him speaking it. It just is like an osmosis thing. So me kind of steeping in his laboratory space for a couple years, I've picked up plenty of information along the way. So I think I can't recall like having a bad take on it, but I do feel that my understanding over the last couple years has over the last year and change has really my understanding has really evolved and solidified just from being in that environment, which is a good thing, because if not, then I'm probably doing it wrong. Like, you should, if you go study a topic under like one of the world's leading experts in it, I hope that you pick up things along the way. Otherwise, you're probably not doing it right.
So episode 261, a grand unified theory of metabolic adaptation, that was about 7 to 8 months ago. 243 was 11 months ago. So they're both within the year where supposedly, you've refined your thing. So I would check out those two Iron Culture episodes, 243, 261.
Beautiful. All right. Well, folks, thank you for being part of this momentous celebration, the 1-year anniversary of Office Hours. I'm looking forward to the 10-year anniversary. That's when you get the champagne out. But thanks so much for joining us, folks. We love having you. We love your questions. We got to almost everything tonight. We did our absolute best, but I got to eat some pizza and get sliced open, so I got to get my dinner in.
For the slices.
Exactly. And Helms, you'll probably be doing different kinds of slices, getting shredded, right? But not for me. I'll be recovering, and if I'm lucid, I'll be writing. If I'm not totally lucid from the anesthesia, I'll be playing my college football video game, which is super cool. So everyone, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. We'll be back in a week. Everyone have a fantastic night or morning, wherever you happen to be, and we will catch you later.